Damaged Defenders by Sherza. Chapter 78. Peter. After his encounter with John, Bobby, and Rogue, Peter had a lot of thinking to do. He returned home that night and spent the next couple of days lying low and thinking. The lying low was because if he was right with his assumptions and the three teens had an in with the Avengers, he wouldn't put it past them to be trying to find him. A brown-haired, brown-eyed teenager named Peter wasn't much to go on in New York City in the normal course of events. This, however, was about as far from the normal course of events as it was possible to get. Peter wasn't going to put anything out of the realm of possibility when it came to Tony Stark. I kid you not, Norse gods of legend, Peter didn't think he'd stop spazzing about that for a while, and very possibly Bruce Banner. So no doing anything that a normal teenager wouldn't do. It would hopefully buy him a little more time if they were looking for him. At first, he had kind of wanted to go thanks but no and not take the teens up on their offer. He'd already lost Uncle Ben, and he couldn't lose Aunt May too. If some jackass with a vendetta tracked her down because he was hanging out with really ultra-visible superheroes. Also, if he took them up on their offer, he'd have to tell Aunt May. She was giving him funny looks as it was. There was no believable explanation for how long he'd be gone whenever he went to the tower to do whatever that didn't involve hanging out with supers. Peter had no idea how she'd react to the news, and honestly, it'd kill him if she turned her back on him. But then Peter really thought about it. If he hung around the Avengers, the risks to Aunt May would increase. Yeah, but there was also the whole thing where it was the Avengers. Peter seriously doubted they'd sit on their butts and tell him tough luck if someone started hurting her. Having that kind of backup to protect her would reduce the danger, because there couldn't be all that many people out there who'd take on two gods, the Hulk, Iron Man, various mutants, and whoever Black Widow and Hawkeye were. Meaning what they were capable of. It stood to reason they were not normal humans, given the company they kept. So, in the best case scenario, Aunt May would be well protected, so that was one con taken care of, leaving him with the other one. The big one. The possibility of her turning her back on him. Part of him knew he was being ridiculous. Aunt May was one of those really common-sensible people. Peter hadn't ever heard her say bad things about mutants in general. Oh, she'd had plenty to say about folks who use their abilities to hurt people or steal or stuff like that, but in general, nope. Still, he couldn't quite dismiss the fear that the mutant-powered thing would prove to be a problem when it stopped being academic and something that other people had to deal with and became something she had to deal with. So those were the cons. The pros, though... yeah, that list was a little longer. Like, he'd have access to people who could help him figure out just how stable his abilities were. Peter had woken up from spectacular nightmares where he continued mutating and eventually became an enormous spider, or where his power stopped working mid-patrol and he fell to his death instead of being able to hang onto the side of a building. Also, he'd have access to better tech. His web slingers worked, but they were by necessity very bare bones and could use a few improvements. Unfortunately, as things stood, Peter just didn't have access to what he needed for the improvements without resorting to stealing. Last but not least, he'd have help figuring out what all he could do and how to make the most of it. He'd figured out a few things on his own, but his ability to experiment was rather limited. There weren't all that many places in the Big Apple where a person could play around with superpowers and not attract attention one way or another. He couldn't really work on it outside of the city due to how long it would take to get somewhere suitable. Not without Aunt May knowing what was going on, anyway. There were also non-powers pros, like the possibility of lab time with Tony Stark and Bruce Banner, something that Peter would never ever say no to because, seriously, it wasn't stupid. Honestly, the more he thought about it, the more he realized going to the Avengers was probably the right thing to do. He had to figure out how to break the news to Aunt May after he talked to the Avengers. That way he'd have somewhere to go if Aunt May freaked out on him. Of course, his luck kicked in. About the time he decided to go to the Avengers, the news stations, which had taken to stalking the tower at all hours, reported the bright light on the roof. Peter had no idea what that was about, but since there hadn't been a portal spewing creepy aliens, he figured it wasn't bad news. Still, he decided to wait a few more days at least, just in case all heck was actually breaking loose and the Avengers were dealing with something. Then the light thing happened again a few days later, and Peter figured out what it might be. Thor and Loki were, well, not from around here, and Peter was dying to find out all about that. It stood to reason that their method of going home for a visit would not involve a car or a plane. He waited until the next morning, which was coincidentally, thankfully, a Saturday. He jammed his suit and web shooters into a backpack, told Aunt May he was heading to the library to do some research for a project, and headed to the tower. He loitered outside of it for a good 15 minutes, cold sweat trickling down his back as his heart tried to beat out of his chest. Eventually, he managed to swallow the fear and anxiety, took a deep breath, and walked in. The lobby was, well, pretty insane. The relief effort was ongoing, and Stark Tower was still playing host to most of the command centers for the various relief groups. At this hour, a lot of teams were either reporting in to find out where they were needed for the day, or coming in after working overnight. SI employees were also streaming in and out due to shift change or running errands or whatever. Not to mention the folks who wandered in for a gander at the lobby and what little else of the tower was open to the general public if they weren't part of a scheduled tour. Oh, and don't forget, said tours. SI had them pretty regularly, trying to lure high school and college students into their sphere of influence. Not that they had to work all that hard at it, really. SI was one of those companies that folks would forfeit a limb to work at. Tony Stark might have a reputation as a man-whore and gadfly, but he made sure his people got treated well and paid even better. The company was well known for its zero-tolerance policy when it came to bigotry and prejudice. Also, the fact that Stark hired brilliant people, no matter where they came from, what they looked like, or what genitals they had been born with or currently possessed. So Peter had read the information available on the net. He was a science geek, and really, SI was pretty much every geek's dream job. He had been looking forward to the tour of the tower his school had scheduled for early June before he'd gotten bitten, and so much had changed. He'd been good enough at the sciences that he dared hoped that he maybe get SI's attention. It'd been a bit of a pipe dream, at least until he got through college anyway, but everyone was entitled to one of those. He headed for the enormous desk, where a quartet of people sat directing traffic and talking to thin air. It took Peter a moment to realize they had headsets on and were probably answering phone calls. He swallowed nervously, then took a deep breath when it was his turn. Hi. Could you, tell John and Rogue that Peter's here? He asked the woman. He was surprised when her face lit with a friendly smile. Of course, sir. We were asked to keep an eye out in case you showed up. She touched her headset. Jarvis, if you would inform John and Rogue that their guest has arrived. Peter didn't hear an answer, but a moment later, the woman pointed towards the bank of elevators. The elevator with the golden red doors, she said, will take you to your friends. Peter managed, just barely, not to snicker at the fact that the elevator that evidently led to the Avengers was in Tony Stark's signature colors. Somewhat to the man's credit, the other elevators were also color-coded. Some had normal silver doors, 2 were black, and 1 had blue doors. Peter assumed the black and blue elevators led to labs or the like, as there were fewer of them than the standard silver elevator doors. He wove his way through the crowds to the elevator, which opened at his approach, startling him. The door closed, and he glanced around, one eyebrow going up when he realized there were no floor buttons or really any way to control where this elevator went, save for an emergency stop button and a phone to contact the outside world if the elevator got stuck. Obviously, this elevator was controlled somewhere else, very probably at the discretion of the Avengers. Peter didn't envy anyone dumb enough to try to get at them this way. The doors opened onto what looked like some sort of entertainment floor or something. At least, there was an enormous television screen and a couple game systems visible that Peter recognized. Also, lots of very comfy-looking seating. Oh, and a kitchen. Cool. That was about all he had time to notice before John and Rogue, who'd been waiting near the elevator for him, greeted him. Peter! Awesome! I was hoping you'd take the offer, man, John said, grinning at him. Peter smiled back reflexively. Thanks. he said. I'm leaning really heavily this way, but I wanted to be sure, you know? Yeah, come on. Everyone's in the dining room. Well, not everyone, John said. You should have come a few days back. We went to Asgard, dude. It was... John blew out her breath. Yeah, it was. Hope we get to go back sometime. Anyway, Cap, Tony, Thor, and Loki are still there, so it's not in the whole gang. That's actually kind of a relief, Peter admitted. I mean, I really want to meet Mr. Stark, but having to deal with everybody all at once might be a bit much. Rogue asked, looking sympathetic. Yeah, that, Peter said. He almost ran out of the dining room half a second after entering it, because even with those four absent, it was really overwhelming. Also, he knew what Black Widow's thing was, the ability to terrify people into incoherence in 2 seconds flat without saying a thing, or really even moving. Peter didn't even need the danger sense that came with his powers to have Danger Will Robinson shrieking in his head at top volume the moment he laid eyes on her. Being the terrifying had to be a superpower. The sweetest pie I wouldn't hurt of soul, smile she flashed at him, probably because he looked as terrified as he felt, did not help. It just made his brain shriek all the louder. The worst part was the vast majority of the people in the room only marginally less terrifying. That included the guy in the suit making an effort to look harmless, which he couldn't possibly be given the company he was keeping. Heck, that he was doing his best to look like a normal businessman just made it worse. The only ones that didn't make him want to run screaming from the room because they terrified him were the black guy he didn't recognize from the publicity the Avengers and X-Men had gotten, and Bruce Banner. Bruce Banner made him want to flail and run from the room for a different reason. Hi, Peter offered when his brain finally stopped gibbering. They invited me? He waved a hand towards John and Rogue, both of whom looked like they were trying very hard not to laugh at him. Relax, man. Nobody's gonna bite you, the black guy said, getting up and coming over, offering a hand. Sam Wilson, since you probably know at least the names this lot goes by in public, I'm a new addition to the gang, so I know how this lot comes across. The look Sam shot Black Widow was telling and relieving. At least Peter wasn't the only one to be scared crapless of her at first meeting, since Sam seemed okay with her now. Peter accepted the handshake and felt himself nodding. As much as the others terrified him, there was something about Wilson that encouraged him to relax and trust the guy. So, John and Rogue said something about you being a mutant? Sam asked. Peter grimaced. Not exactly.